Hey, welcome back to the channel. This is your host, Reverend Ken Chiarelli. How you doing today? I hope you're having a blessed day. I have an exciting show today. A lot of people who run churches, who are starting a church, or have churches for a while, have experienced the problems with the law. If you don't have your church set up properly with all of the documents and all of the things that go with it, include from setting up your tax structure to everything else, you can get into some major, major problems. So today I have a special guest from the Church Legal Center, Reverend Joseph, Reverend John Joseph Esquire is going to be on the show. And he's going to be talking about the important things that you need to know about setting up your church. So without further ado, I'd like to bring him on to the show. And how are you doing today, Reverend?
Doing fine, Ken. Thank you so much for having me today.
So we were talking a little bit a while before about how you were in a different type of law before this, and then you just seemed to be led by the Lord to go into legal representation for churches. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure, thank you. When I got out of law school, passed a bar, and I started working at a law firm and started doing litigation, trial work, deposition hearings, jury trials, things of that nature. And I got active in a local church, and then the pastor invited me onto the deacon board. And then I became involved more with church work before I was doing more civil practice. And then as that progressed, I found that I found the Lord calling on my life to do full-time ministry in terms of law or in church work, and I got ordained.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was doing that and working at churches as either an administrative pastor or an executive pastor, the Lord just brought churches to me that needed help, both from whether starting as incorporation through dissolution. And then the Lord just through many different ways can just encourage me to go ahead and open up my own practice. So I have the Church Legal Center, and I represent many churches, both small, large, schools, things of that nature, to help them correctly follow the laws of the state of Florida, and of course better equip themselves to do the work of the ministry because their legal work is done properly. So that's what I do. Like I said, I've got an office here in Minneola, Florida. It's outside of Orlando. I have churches from Key West to Jacksonville of all different sizes, all different flavors. And my burden is to help the local church. And that's what I do full time.
And that's a fantastic thing. Is, as we've said in the past, the purpose of this channel is to bring the body of Christ all the information it needs. It's too fragmented, and many of the body of Christ churches and people just don't know where to go to get the help, all the things that they need. So today's show is going to be about if you're going to start a church, or you have a church, or you're going to be starting a church charity. We're going to be going into some of the various ideas. If you haven't done so already, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the channel. You can support the channel by buying us a cup of coffee. You'll see the link as a donation. So, John, what do you think is one of the first most important things that a church should be doing when they're setting up their legal stuff?
Okay. So the most important thing is to make sure that you're incorporated correctly. And what I mean by that is in Florida, you can go to a SunBiz page, SunBiz, and type in to start your church as a nonprofit, Chapter 617 corporation, and fill in a few blanks, and then you get approved and you're up and going as a nonprofit entity. The problem with just doing that simple process is it doesn't comply with the IRS requirements to be a 501c3. So you can go ahead and follow the steps to be a legitimate Florida nonprofit corporation, but if you were to make application with the IRS to be a 501c3, you would be rejected. And let me explain what that means, Ken. It just means there's language that the IRS requires in your articles of incorporation to be recognized by the IRS as an exempt entity if you apply. That's not required under the Florida SunBiz requirements under nonprofit law. So long story short, you can do the short way of doing it that's cheaper by doing it yourself. But if you were to apply for a 501c3, it would not work. That's probably the most important thing I just want to get out there about starting the local church.
Most importantly, so if a church right now is just beginning, that would be one of the most important things that they would need to start to change in their dynamic, right?
Right. I would recommend if you're already incorporated and you just simply have the SunBiz requirements, someone just like an accountant or a member of the church filled out the SunBiz form, and you're operating as a church. I'll say this: the IRS recognizes churches that have not filed for a 501c3 as exempt entity if they follow 12 to 14 aspects of a church, and they have a list of all those things that a church must do, such as communion, worship, preaching of the word, teaching, following tenets of faith, things like that. So you can still operate, but you have to follow those requirements. And a lot of churches don't recognize what all those requirements are, or may not know what all those requirements are. But if you are operating, I would definitely look into making sure you follow those. If you wish, you can take the next step, which is make application for a 501c3. Maybe amend your articles of incorporation. I do that a lot for churches, where I include that language now by amending their articles so it complies with both Florida and federal, and then make application for 501c3. And churches typically like to do that, Ken, because you will receive back from the IRS what's called a letter of determination. And a letter of determination says, we recognize your church as an exempt entity. Exempt meaning, and let me just divulge a little bit here, exempt meaning that you don't pay federal income tax for your income that comes in, and contributions to the church are considered donations, of which the donor gets tax benefit. And then once you get that letter of determination, you can then show donors, and usually high-level donors would like to see that, by the way, that their donations would be recognized by the IRS as being given to an exempt entity. So that does help the church having that 501c3. However, if you don't have it, you simply follow the SunBiz requirements, you can still operate. You just want to make sure that you operate under the guidelines of what the IRS defines as a church. So you'll be fine with the IRS.
That's great. That's great. So now that we've got the taxes set up and you've got your church running, okay, there are a lot of other parts of a church that need to be legally set up. Can you talk about some of those?
Sure. I think the next most important thing is you make sure you have your EIN number. You make sure you made application with the state of Florida for your exemption of sales tax. You know, sales tax exemption is a great benefit. That's not hard at all. They're just simply filling out a form. And then after that, which are important but are simple, I would recommend looking at a set of bylaws to operate your church. And what do I mean by that, Ken? What I mean is that a bylaw is like the roadmap of where we go as a church and how we operate. You know, when I was a kid, we had board games, and on the top of the board box was the directions, right? I mean, if you want to know how to play Monopoly or Life or Risk, you look at the back of the box top and it tells you. That is what the bylaws are for a local church. It's how you operate. What are the rules? Who can do what? So having a good bylaw is required, a good set of bylaws. Now, as a matter of fact, let me just say this. Under Florida law, under 617, churches don't have to have bylaws, because if you don't have bylaws, then the Florida statute will govern what you do, but you can have bylaws. And I urge churches to have a current set of bylaws. And that will then help everyone know who does what. Is there a board of directors? Is there a board of deacons? What's the pastor's responsibility? What's the member's responsibility? Importantly, what happens if a member deviates from the standard of beliefs that you have? How can you then remove that member? That's very important too. So the bylaws, I would say, Ken, is a very important aspect. Now, saying that, I'll say, well, what about a constitution? I hear my church has a constitution. Maybe a church down the street has a constitution. Currently, most churches avoid creating constitutions in the newer entities. A lot of the older entities have them. Those that do have them currently is because they just put their belief systems in the Constitution and then put in the bylaws how they operate as a church. It can work both ways. It's just a matter of preference for the church leader.
Right. And of course, because there's so many versions of Christianity, from Baptist to Catholic to Pentecostal, church government also becomes a problem or a situation in running those organizations. And what happens, you know, if the pastor wants to leave, or that you want to remove the pastor or one of the elders, that would be covered under that governance that you're talking about, correct?
That's absolutely correct. And I do, a matter of fact, in my office here, I have several files regarding removal of pastors. doing severance and separation agreements for pastors and voting on removing pastors. And that really is varied among churches. I'll say it this way, Ken. The local church is like a diamond. It's got many facets, and every facet's different, and they shine differently. But in most cases, what happens is the bylaws might say that the church votes in the senior pastor, and then the board or the church membership votes out the pastor. And you do need to make sure you put those safety measures in there so that we all understand how you can make changes in your leadership if it's necessary. And that should be outlined in the bylaws. It's not really something you put in the articles of incorporation, but you should put that in the bylaws so everyone knows how it's done properly, because you don't want everyone saying, how do we do this? How do we remove a staff pastor? How do we remove a senior pastor? Or maybe a board member who's gone rogue. What's the process to remove him? That should all be clearly outlined in the bylaws.
Now, when people are trying to set these things up, do you have like a reference point? Do you have like a book of bylaws that they could reference to, or do they have to make them up on their own?
Good question, Ken. Most churches, if they don't have it, what I suggest is this. I suggest most pastors have acquaintances, colleagues who have a similar belief system they have. First, encourage them to touch base with them. They get a copy of their bylaws. If you have an acquaintance that really is a well-liked, respected pastor, get his bylaws. Take a look at it. Get it in a Word document. Play with it. And then I get a lot of times, Ken, I get a call from a pastor or a board saying, we're creating our bylaws. Would you look it over for me and give us some suggestions? And usually I'll review that and say, well, you're missing this, let's say on gay marriage, or you're missing this on removal of a rogue pastor or a board member or a member. And I'll make some suggestions, and then they can retain me to do the drafting, or they could do the drafting themselves. But I would recommend the first step is get with someone that, is more or less follows what you believe, and see how his church does it. Now, I do have pastors say, John, I formed the church, or John, you formed our church. I need you to put together a set of bylaws. Of course, I offer that service, and I put together a simple set of bylaws that they can follow, and then they tweak it as they go along.
Great. So now the church has grown. And now you're going to hire a secretary, and you're going to hire lawn maintenance, and you're going to hire these people. And the question now, the next part of the legal matters comes, liabilities, payroll, and stuff like that. So what would be the next part of setting up the church and all of these things?
Okay, I'll say this in a very cursory way, a basic way. And let me just say, Ken, from the outset, what we're talking about here and what I'm saying is legal information, not legal advice to someone, because, I'm just conveying legal information. That's all. But I would say the following is the bare minimum. I would say, okay, you interview someone, keep your interview notes, even if you don't hire them, just in case there's an allegation to the EEOC that you discriminate against them. Make sure you have notes of that. If you do hire them, make sure you file the proper documents with the state of Florida for a new hire. Make sure that the immigration status has been verified. You want to make sure that once you start hiring them, you comply with at least a minimum wage that's required. You want to make sure that you follow the basic laws to do that. And then once you have your employees and one employee in place, let's say it's your first hire, it could be a secretary or a youth pastor or something. You want to make sure that you properly maintain an employee file. That's probably the most important thing, because a lot of churches don't. A church will contact me saying, John, I'll give you an example. I got a call from a pastor who said, John, I'm just going to fire my secretary. I'm just so tired of her. She's such a pain. And I said, well, why are you doing that? Well, he gave me all these reasons. And I said, how long has she been with you? He said, well, about 20 years. I said, okay. So I was expecting him to tell me he had these evaluations of her showing that she was a problem. He never opened an employee file and had never done an evaluation of her. Okay. And I said, Pastor, we're at an at-will state. Yes, you can fire and they can leave, but there's also civil rights that you have to make sure you don't run over. And plus, she's over the age of 40, so you have the age civil rights there. And I said, you need to make sure you do your evaluations before you fire them, so you can justify your action. He says, well, I'll do it today and I'll give her a doozy. I said, well, that's not what I mean. So what I'm just saying is you want to make sure that when you do have an employee, you do your evaluations, you maintain your employee file. If there's issues with the employee, you want to make sure you document them, go over that with the employee, have them sign it that they've received that notification so that later, should you have to terminate or release or separate, you have justification for that. So I would say the first step when you hire your first employee, maintain an employee file, do your evaluations, and that's probably the most important thing I can say at this point as you're hiring your first employee.
Okay, and these are all good tips that the average church member, church pastor, like you said, doesn't know, doesn't think about, because he's just concerned about spreading the gospel. And but now the church is growing, and okay, they've acquired some new properties, and the church is growing, and all of these things. So what some of the next problems or things that the church might have to look into in doing?
Okay. So now the church assets are growing. Basically, I'm hearing you say that they have property. Well, you want to make sure that the property is deeded in the name of the corporation, not in the names of deacons or bishops, which I see often. I've got one on my desk right now where the property was transferred to the church, but it was transferred in the names of a prior board members. That can become somewhat problematic. So you want to make sure that now that the church has grown, it's got property, that it's dated in the church's corporate name. You want to make sure now, since it has assets, you recognize the fact that it is now a target for lawsuits because it has assets. So you want to make sure you maintain a very good general liability policy to cover for issues such as automobile accidents, slips and falls, and then also the issue of child molestation.
Oh, yes.
You got to make sure, and this is so critical, that as you're growing your church and you have children's ministries and youth ministries or youth events, that your staff, your workers are all screened properly. You want to make sure that there's general liability policy plus a waiver, or excuse me, a rider of child molestation or any kind of sexual offenses that might take place, so you're covered, because you don't want to face that kind of a tragedy without proper liability insurance. So let's make sure that the church is set up with proper liability insurance, automobile. If you have an employee, check into, whether you must maintain workman's compensation policy. There is a cost to growing a church, but these costs are really a transfer of risk type processes where if something does go wrong, the insurance company then would be on the hook to pay for some of the errors that might have taken place. So these are very valuable things. So as a church grows, I really encourage pastors to make sure their liability insurance is in place. I got a call just yesterday, regarding a church with an issue of a counseling allegation. Well, you got to make sure. First question I had for the pastor is, was, do you have counseling insurance on your liability policy? Do you have that separate rider? So the more things you do, you want to make sure you're covered legally and by liability insurance for those activities.
Yes. So what other things now, we've gotten to this point, would you recommend as the church is growing to make sure that they have done, the church now decides it's going to add a school or it's going to add a food pantry or things like that? What's some of the other things that that they might have to consider as they are growing?
Okay, very good question. When I get a call from a pastor who's wanting to start a school or has a school, the first question I ask is, okay, is that school a separate corporation from your church corporation? In other words, we want to make sure that that the church is separated from any liabilities which may take place at the school. Now, you don't have to do that. There's reasons to do it and there's reasons not to do it. So let's talk about that briefly. If you have a separate corporation for the school, well, then that's going to have their own liability policy, and that if a tragedy takes place at the school, it won't affect the assets of the church, right?
Right.
Now, we got to be careful with that, because the tendency of church leaders is to create boards within the church to operate the school. So churches have a real hard time of letting go of control, but you have to make sure they have separate boards. That's what's called the Chinese wall between the two of them. Now, some churches don't want that. They want to control what happens at the school. They want to have a say in it. They want to make sure the board is their board people, which is fine. But in that case, let's make sure there's proper liability insurance to cover both the school and the church. So if there is an issue at either, both are protected. So you want to make sure that there's current liability insurance for the church and current liability for the school. And that way, the activities that might take place between them would not affect them detrimentally, at least financially.
Okay.
That's a really important aspect of that.
Right. Is there anything else that a church should be considering doing as they grow? Just some quick ideas for the pastors and things to look out for.
Um, I would say probably one of the things you want to do is check and make sure that the activities of the church aren't creating unnecessary risks, such as hazards or dangerous activities. Some of these activities with youth sometimes can run into lawsuits because there's injuries associated with them. And maybe that event or that activity wasn't really necessary. I'll give you an example. There was a court case where a youth group had a sleepover, very benign. You wouldn't think anything would ever happen at a sleepover. But what they did was they let a few kids out to go to McDonald's really quick. Well, one of the kids got killed by a car crossing the road to the McDonald's, and the church got involved with a wrongful death case. So that you have to think about your activities and the risks and what you do by allowing youth to participate, let's say, in other activities while that activity is going on. Other thing is negligent supervision. I would say making sure that people that work with children are properly screened and also are very, very mindful to watch what they're doing. And what I mean by that is this. There was a court case where the children were in a nursery and there was infants and toddlers in the same room. And there was a woman in there with a rocking chair going back and forth, watching the TV as the service is going on, holding an infant. But because there was infants in the room as well as toddlers, and that was because of the size of the church, they had to combine them. You'll see on the video that one of the toddler's arms came off by the rocker because she was rocking and she severed the arm of one of the children.
Whoa.
And because there was so much noise in there, when watching TV, she wasn't really paying attention. Obviously, that case was settled too. But I think probably making sure that the age groups of children are separated appropriately, that the workers you get are mindful and watchful. You'll make sure that they are engaged with watching and taking care of the children. So avoiding negligent supervision is really huge. I think a third point for churches to consider is this, and that is making sure that the offerings are taken, that there's internal controls in place to prevent embezzlement. I run into embezzlement often, and it's really unfortunate. What happens in a lot of churches is ushers collect the offering, and then one usher takes it to the safe or the drop box. Well, that is not ever good. You should always have at least two people. Then you should make sure you have at least 2 or 3 people count it, who's separate from the person who makes the deposit. Mm-hmm. And you treat married couples as one, not as 2 people. So a married couple should have at least 3 people, themselves and another person with them. These internal controls prevents the theft, the temptation of certain individuals to steal. And people steal from churches all the time.
Yes.
Just all the time. So you want to make sure as a church leader, as you're doing the offering, make sure there's proper internal controls for that to take place.
Yeah, one of the things that we, when we had built a building of the church that we had helped build, and when we set up the church offices, we put sliding glass doors on all the offices, and we made it in a circular motion so that when someone was being counseled, no matter what was going on, the secretary or somebody could see what was going on. So if anybody said something had happened, there was a visual. That no, that never happened. This didn't happen. And of course, as CVT cameras have come about, they're putting cameras in every room, recording everything going on, so that if anything does go on. Because one of the things I tell people that people believe when they go to a church that okay, I am safe. But I tell people, you've got to understand when you put your pocketbook down on the pew, and you go walk and go get some coffee, and you come back, other people look at that and say, "Oh, it's Christmas time." You put your cell phone down on the thing, and somebody says, "Oh, God must have heard my prayer about a new phone," and grabs it and takes it. And so people have to be aware, and the leadership needs to be inform people that yes, this is God's house, but you need to be aware of your surroundings because the devil is always coming in and trying to do something and mess with people. Well, anyway, do you have anything else you want to add before we finish up the show?
Okay. The only thing I could add is the economy right now looks like it's sluggish. It looks like things are slowing down, and when
Hmm.
that takes place, sometimes offerings may drop a little bit, and there's a temptation of pastors to convert designate offerings into general operating funds. That's a risk. That's called breach of trust. I'd be careful of that. And also, pastors get approached oftentimes by commercial entities to lease their property for additional revenue stream.
Hmm.
I'm not talking about cell towers. I do cell tower agreements, but I'm talking about like food trucks that come by or entities that want to just use your property. I'm just saying you got to be very careful with that because you can lose your ad valorem exemption if you allow for-profit entities to use your property to make money. So there's different things you have to be really careful for. I would just say if a pastor is listening to this and you've been approached to use your property by for-profit entities, talk to an attorney to make sure you don't violate the IRS code on that, or at least your local um, uh, property tax exemption, because you don't want to lose it. A church in Miami got a bill for $5 million because they leased their property to a Christian for-profit school. It cannot be for-profit, even though it's Christian. So there is some nuances here. So I'm just saying that's another aspect you might want to watch out for going forward.
Excellent, excellent. You're a church, you're a charitable organization. Setting up your legal matters is one of the most important things you can do. We don't want to leave our schools, our churches open for liabilities and accidents to happen. And that's one of the reasons I brought on Reverend John Joseph Esquire, that you guys can get a taste of what could happen in your church if you make a mistake. Now, I'm going to leave you the information to his organization, the Church Legal Center, in the description. If you have any questions for him, you can reach out to him. He operates in the state of Florida, not out of it. And so if you're out of the state and you're watching this video, he might be able to refer you to a legal counsel somewhere in your state. But if you want a quick question, you could reach out to him and we'll leave you that information. One of the important things, of course, is that you can buy us a cup of coffee as a donation to keep the channel. Check out my other videos. We have a recent one on Psalm 103. Why it's one of the most important psalms, that if you're having any sickness or disease going on in your family, it's one of the most important psalms you can pray. And I have other information from other people who've come on the show who can give you some great advice. Thanks for being on the show, John. And
Thanks for having me, Ken, very much. Thank you.